hello. My name is, hello to those of you who are here gathered in the room in Weiser Hall on the campus of the University of Michigan, as well as those joining us virtually over Zoom. My name is Benjamin Paloff. Where is the cameras over there? Yes. My name is Benjamin Paloff. It's going to be a talk on film. This is important. My name is Benjamin Paloff. I'm the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at the University of Michigan. And it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you all to this talk by film director Camilla Kutz, who is visiting us from London and is also premiering her most recent film at the Ann Arbor Film Festival this weekend. I think Sunday, yes. Sunday, excellent. So before I do the formal introductions of our speaker today and her talk, I want to alert the audience to a few upcoming events. On Thursday, March 24th, that's next week, I'll get out of the way here, there's going to be a symposium co-sponsored by the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies called Imaginative Activism of Digital Citizens. This is a collaboration between CREASE faculty associate Irina Aristarkova, who's professor of art and design at digital studies at the University of Michigan, working together with Dr. Sasha Razor, who's a Slavist curator at UCLA. So this will be Thursday, March 24th at from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Zoom. You can find the links and information on the website. On March 25th, the very next day, you can see we have a very busy schedule, especially with recent events in our corner of the world. We have an event entitled Working in Ukrainian Film and Television Before the War. It's a Q&A session with Irina Zhigalyuk, television and film producer, scriptwriter, and filmmaker. And this is organized and co-sponsored by the Flying Subtitles Collective, which is operated by Anya Eisman in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. And then finally, on Sunday, March 27th at 1:15 p.m. at the Michigan Theater here in Ann Arbor on Liberty Street, we will have the North American premiere of Camilla Kutz's film, What We Shared, at the Ann Arbor Film Festival. The talk today relates to that premiere. And asks the question, how do artists respond to events that shatter pre-existing ways of apprehending the world? Looking at What We Shared, Camilla Kutz's new film, a hybrid artist film set in the de facto state of Abkhazia. This illustrated artist talk proposes that in order to effectively process and offer valuable insights into the unrepresentable events that contain multiple truths, that is, events such as war and ethnic conflict, it becomes necessary to examine emotions as documents of historical significance. Informed by the writings of Svetlana Alexievich, Svetlana Boym, and Viktor Shklovsky, this talk argues that engaging with archived memory and trauma today requires experiential responses to testimony that these responses challenge, and that these responses challenge the rigidly defined categories of objectivity, fact, and fiction. This is a talk very, very close to my own heart and my own research. Our speaker, Dr. Camilla Kutz, explores stories that subvert dominant narratives of history, and especially those narratives that relate to post-Soviet identities. She is a 2021 German Award nominee. Her first feature film, What We Shared, 2021, premiered at the 65th BFI London Film Festival and was described as one of the, quote, the finest examples of UK filmmaking, unquote, on festival scope. Dr. Kutz is the author and editor of numerous books and articles on experimental media, including Visions of Avant-Garde Film, which is published by Indiana University Press. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Camilla Kutz.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, for this very generous introduction. Thank you again to Chris for inviting me. Please, thank you so much, Derek, for all your help with the presentation, of course, to the University of Michigan. Thank you for all of you, to all of you for being here, to all of you on Zoom. I also would like to thank an Albert Film Festival who has continuously screened my work over the last few years. I would also like to acknowledge the center's efforts to bring scholars from Ukraine to the United States. I hope more schools will follow that. I believe we in America have so many Slavic departments. I think it's an amazing effort, particularly, of course, in these difficult times. I think the news continues to be devastating, and every morning I open with my laptop and look at the news, and I just want to crawl back to bed. Not think about it, but of course we've got to be thinking about it. And I think I want to say that my heart goes to Ukrainian people, but I also would like to acknowledge the small but not insignificant efforts of Russian people who have been opposing the regime to the best of their ability, who are facing imprisonment. There's a Guardian article this morning that I'll recommend everybody to read. Okay, so I think I'm going to start. Thank you once again for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about, as Benjamin said, my latest film, which is titled What We Shared, and which is, I would argue that this is a form of collective response to the Georgian Abkhaz war that happened in 1992 and 93. And I would also like to acknowledge that my executive producer is a Detroit-based Katie McGowan, who is a former artistic director of an Albert Film Festival. And Katie has done amazing work and getting the film out there, so the more screen is coming out soon. Okay, so there's my that's it. Okay. Yes, so one of my key questions as I was making the film was, how do artists respond to events that shatter our pre-existing view of the world as we know it? And of course, we're back there in this situation right now as history continues to repeat itself. And in my talk, I will be drawing upon the writings of three major figures of Russian literature and critical studies, all of whom I believe all of you know. So Svetlana Alexievich and her ideas of feelings as documents, Svetlana Boym on Diasporic Intimacy, and Viktor Shklovsky on the idea of Ostranenie. So I'm going to propose, as Benjamin already said, that working with archive, memory, and trauma these days requires experiential engagement with testimony, and that more experiential engagement with testimony allows us to challenge definitive categories such as objectivity, fact, and fiction. Okay. So I'm going to start from thinking about archive. Why? So historically, typically defined as a collection of historical documents or records that provide information about a place or a group of people, and more importantly, usually curated or designed by a person team that's part of the establishment. And scholars such as Ariela Aisha Azulay, my research is very close to what Azulay has been working on in the last few years, has performed a lot of critiques on the Western ways of archiving, of course, as Western archives as imperial institutions. So she has questions ways in which information has been collected, stored, and made accessible or not to the people, and demanded agency for those contained within archives, which is something that's very important to my film, as we'll see. So Svetlana Alexievich's claim that feelings are documents provided a guide for me for my presentation, but also for my method of performative and experiential archiving, which is something that I've developed during the set of What We Shared. And it's the method that attempts to offer insights into the unrepresentable events that contain multiple truths, such as war, ethnic conflict. And in this method, I treat people's feelings, dreams, memories, and emotions about the war as documents of historical significance. So for quite some time now, I've been engaging in explorations of the complexities of post-Soviet identities. I made works about growing tensions between collective and personal memories. And this is a couple of films that Ann Arbor Film Festival has shown in the past. And I think You Should Come to America is a film about a paradoxical fascination that Poles like myself, who have grown up in communist Poland, had with America as a land of freedom. And the film is further complicated by a voiceover narration, which is based on my epistolary exchange with a Native American incarcerated Native American man, thus challenging the idea of America as a land of freedom. And then a film that I made in Georgia in 2016 called Batum, which is very much about the history of the town and people's attachments to certain historical stereotypes and figures such as Stalin. So whereas my work, this early work deals with the beginning of the process of the collapse of the Soviet Union, this latest film, what we share, is about the fallout that followed the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the impact it had on people, individuals and communities. So I want to look at one of the opening scenes of the film, so then we're all clear about the geographical locations. So.
Once upon a time, in the land of Abkhazia, everyone lived together. The Abkhaz, the Mingrelians, the Georgians, the Armenians, the Russians, the Greeks, and others, as was often the way in Soviet society. People went back and forth to each other's houses for each other's christenings and weddings and funerals. Then came the 90s and the war with Georgia. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and now weapons are kept at home just in case. Today, the Abkhazians see themselves as de facto independent. The Western world sees them as part of Georgia.
So what we shared began as part of an artist residency that I did with an amazing organization called Sklat Cultural Center, which is based in the capital of Abkhazia, Sukhumi. And it's an organization that aims to revitalize the local artist scene. And Sukhumi actually has a lot of artists, visual artists. It's got quite a dynamic, a little traditional theater scene. So this is an organization that in 2018 had a residency titled The Archive. And what we shared has roots in the tragic loss of the Abkhaz State Archive that was destroyed in one of the first days of the war with Georgia. And this was, of course, erupted following tensions between different ethnic groups in Abkhazia, so Armenians, Georgians, Mingrelians. And this archive held archaeological records of Abkhazia's history, the origins of its language, as well as documents of all the various populations that lived in Abkhazia. And it was a testimony to how, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, before 1989, Abkhazia was a multi-ethnic and multicultural place. And conflicting interpretations of the Soviet past by the Abkhaz and the Georgians, alongside Abkhazia's demand for greater political power and autonomy from Georgia, intensified as the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course, in effect, the Abkhaz-Georgian war had so thousands killed on each side of the conflict, and 250,000 ethnic Georgians still cannot return to their countries. So it's still an ongoing issue that has not been resolved, despite a lot of attempts at reconciliation. So, although recognized by Russian Federation, Abkhazia remains a de facto state, where unprocessed trauma of almost 30 years ago still hinders the country's progress. And Abkhazia is often referred to by a lot of scholars as what's called a stable isolation. And it's a consequence, of course, of geopolitical entanglements between Russian Federation and the USA, more clearly NATO. But in the film, I was mainly concerned with the people who remain casualty in this conflict. But I want to make very clear that while making this film, I was not interested in making a documentary. And I'll come back to that really later. Sadly, what happened in Abkhazia happened in Moldova and Transnistria in the 90s. continues to play out in a conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, which is Azerbaijan and Armenia. And it's happening in Ukraine right now as Putin pushes forward his attempts at reclaiming these territories. So the urgency of my film is grounded in a universal ethical question, how to give testimony to an event that cannot be conveyed as such, an event that in itself contains multiple truths. And I just want to show you another clip from very early in the film.
ويبخي أحطولا مرقلرة بيختخي أقر مراح يخش ماتز سنيز بس وان زيز بخس في ساقلي أو يدز خمز ينقا أبنر خضرنا أميوكا أبنر خلنا أبرزن خوزمز نقر يغلب سنخجز تاسا سارق خزدك يغلب وان زيز بسبستازارجا أقزر يسبان برتتب قصقاقي زايقو وبسقان ستشي نريد الجد بسبخز شلبجا بخز وي شبخز لبجا بس
So let me just walk it back a little bit and tell you a little about the process of making the film. So when I initially went to Surume in 2019 for a month-long period to complete the residency, I had originally wanted to interview people about their dreams. I've got quite an interest in psychoanalysis, particularly human analysis and dreams. And of course, very quickly I realized that almost with no exception, all the dreams that were shared with me were the dreams that related to the war. And that was the material I ended up working with, even though originally it was not actually my intention to do so. So in this first part, I want to talk a little bit about my method of performative and experiential archiving. This is quite a new research that I'm still working on. I'm still refining the method and adding new things to it, adding more interdisciplinary approaches. So I'm going to test it in my next film, hopefully. But I want to look at the process of making film through the lens of this performative and experiential archiving. So while writing this script, so what I did is that I went to Abkhazia in 2018, spent a month, interviewed about 20 people, didn't do much filming, did some observational filming, but nothing with any participants or performers. And then I returned to London, struggled, thinking how to make sense of this place, what to do and how to do it. In the end, in around 2019, I ended up writing a script based on all the testimonies that people have shared with me. And I became very interested, a lot of those testimonies were about the dreams, the dreams about the war. And I became very interested in this idea of how do private dreams and fantasies act out on the public arena. So usually we think about, so basically what I thought is that what emerged for me while I was in Abkhazia was that one should not really understand Abkhazia as a fallen place as a result of people's dreams or nightmares. Is actually the other way around, that because Abkhazia had been falling for so long since the collapse of the Soviet Union, people's dreams started reflecting that, even though on a conscious level, they might not have known exactly what was coming. So I started, since the archive did not exist in Abkhazia by the time I got there, I started thinking, what can an archive be in the wake of its absence? And again, I understand archive very, very broadly. And more importantly, can we think of the lack of archive as an opportunity to create a new archive that does not deny the past, but perhaps looks towards the future, and looks towards the future that is post-conflict? But of course, that's a very complicated question because it requires multiple collaborations and efforts of many, many people, not just artists, but politicians. Yeah, mainly. So anyway, I began thinking of our film set as an archive and thinking about how we shared our stories and experiences and how the set became some form of a living repository. And sets, you probably know this, but sets can be very, very stressful environments. No matter how prepared you are, how well you know what you're doing, people feel differently on different days. Doesn't matter what you're filming. So, but our set nonetheless felt more like a family. So here's Banana, Big Baba, who's one of the key performers in the film, and my assistant director James Norton, who came with me from London on my second trip. So, like I said, on our set, we shared stories, dreams. We also disagreed a lot. We debated numerous times. I was challenged by my collaborators on ways I wrote their testimonies down, which was a very important part of the process and part of the developing the method of performative and experiential archiving. And through those discussions and negotiations, we also formed long-lasting friendships. And in some ways, at that point, the process of making the film became more interesting to me and more important than the actual outcome, which I still didn't know what it was going to be. So I want to say that on the set of what we shared, objectivity gave way to subjective scenarios that revealed the felt and experienced truth, while also not denying facts of historical significance. Ours was a set with stories accessible to all. It is a set in which the notion of authorship was transformed into the process of negotiating agency of all of those involved in the creation of the film. And of course, I am still credited as mostly the sole author of the film, although in the credits, I do thank my participants as contributors, but there is a question around, of course, how participatory the actual editing of the film is, which is a slightly different story to making of the film, but we can maybe talk about that later. So through the sharing of stories and experiences, we developed what late Svetlana Boym calls diasporic intimacy. So for Boym, diasporic intimacy can only be approached only through indirection and intimation, through stories and secrets. And diasporic intimacy, as Boym argued, is spoken in a foreign language that reveals the inadequacies of translation. And to her, diasporic intimacy does not promise an unmediated emotional fusion, but only a precarious affection, no less deep and aware of its transient nature. And here I was thinking of Colombian curator Jose Roca's idea of temporary communities and how we created a temporary community on set. And it's still, in some ways, although it was temporary, we all stayed in touch, and actually a lot of my performance participants formed amazing friendships, and they meet until this day. And many of them, even though Suhumi is a small town, there's few of them that didn't know each other prior to the making of the film. So all of our sharing, exchanges, and discussions and working together on the set have eventually led me to working on this method. And I want to say that although the methods, I've developed originally the ideas for the method in the context of the Georgian-Abkhaz war and in Abkhazia, it's a method that I see as being transferable and being used in different contexts, different circumstances. So eventually, I think because the aim of the method is to get to the truth of shared human experiences. In the future, I'm currently applying for funding that will allow me to create a toolkit for that method to then be adapted in different places. So I want to stress once again that performative and experiential archiving is a collaborative method, participatory method of working with performers, whether they're professional, non-professional, or participants, however you want to describe them. And in this method, participants are invited to co-design the script and decide on ways in which they want to be filmed and represented, or at least enter into some kind of a conversation with the filmmaker. So, like I said, on the set, there were numerous instances where image actors queried lines in the script. They, for the right reason, challenged me on some of the stuff I wrote, and then we negotiated what they were comfortable with, and very often we very, very quickly adapted the script on the set, which was something I've never done before. And we also have numerous examples where we filmed particular scenes. I filmed them the way I wanted them, and then we collectively discussed them. And then I went back and I showed them, because collectively we came up with ideas that were so much better than what I wrote in my own room in London myself. So doing this made me realize that working in conflict zones, but also working in places that are not artists' own, but this idea of collaboration, negotiation, participation is really, I think, one of the most valuable methods. But going in there with this sole authorship script and saying, this is what we're going to do, it's not going to work. It's never going to work. And I'm glad I didn't in the end. So I want to just show you this scene and just tell you this is one of the scenes in which Manana Big Baba, one of the performers, was in a picture before, shared a dream with me. And she shared this dream with me in 2018, and pretty much every artist who had gone to Abkhazia to do this residency had heard a version of this dream. And we went and filmed this dream. We filmed it as Manana told me, as I scripted it. And then 2 days later, we were very happy with this. I showed her the takes. We were very happy with it. But 2 days later, she calls me and says, I had another dream. I had a dream about us filming my dream. And that was really amazing because we're both quite avid dreamers. We were exchanging a lot of dreams, like I said. And so she tells me this dream and my head is exploding. Going like, we've got to go and reshoot that. We've got to go and refilm that. So that's what we did. So in the original version of the dream, Manana doesn't walk into the sea, but in the dream she had on top of the dream, she does. So that's what we did.
Это был 1991 год. Я жила в Одессе. Мы с моей подружкой, армянкой, сидели на пляже. Мы завернулись в полотенце и приятно беседовали, когда я вдруг заметила людей, целые семьи, матери, отцы, бабушки, дедушки с детьми, и шагали в воду в молчании, как будто бы они были под гипнозом. Через некоторое время вода стала накрывать детей с головой. Они шли очень медленно.
So I want to reiterate once again that this method of performative and experiential archiving is a method that involves collaborative negotiation and creation of archives of human experiences and then capturing them in a moving image work. But I also want to make the point that the language of performative and experiential archiving, as I currently understand it, is not that of documentary, as traditionally understood form. Because with this film, with what we shared, I was aiming at disrupting common representations of marginalized, in which individuals and groups are often seen through the trope of brutal and quite unforgiving realism as a very, very particular aesthetic. And while working on this film, I realized that seldomly do we see collectively created, dream-enhanced, and poetic narratives that challenge the seemingly objective expository modes of documentary filmmaking that form some kind of a golden rule. And here I was very much guided by some of the writings of Jacques Rancière, and particularly his passage when he talks about the ideas around documentary fiction and the idea that the real, when you work in media, of course, everything is mediated, and the real is an effect that is being produced as opposed to a fact that needs to be understood. And that also speaks to my idea of facts being felt as opposed to facts being understood, because events such as war are so incomprehensible that I think going with the feeling, going with the emotion yields much more authentic results, I think. So in my previous work, I have explored Sigmund Freud's ideas of screen memory. Sean walked in the right moment. The idea of screen memory is repetition compulsion, and I was attracted to the idea of how when each time we recall a traumatic memory, we actually create a new one. That's a known theory now. And something that I will return to in a little bit in relation to Svetlana Alexievich's writings, but something that's very relevant to my idea, my method, in which the accuracy of a traumatic memory is not as important as the feeling that's associated with the original trauma. So I want to say that my film, what we shared, is in no way about creating a make-believe scenarios, but it's about destabilizing the opposition between fact and fiction. And to that end, these reenactments that the performers have performed of their dreams and memories became a building blocks of reality, their reality as opposed to an escape from reality. So my method of performative and experiential archiving treats a human as an archive with all its contradictions, all its conflicting narratives. It's their memories, dreams, and body as an archive. And I want to say that, again, this is a known fact that traumatic events tend to be recalled differently by the same people, by people being in the same room at the same time. And then we have to somehow find space for all of that, for all of those voices to become part of the meta-truth or meta-narrative. So, of course, as I've already talked about, my idea of performative and experiential archiving required a very significant reconceptualization of what an archive was and what it could be. And the focus was, like I said, not on establishing, confirming or challenging historical narratives or facts, but it was more about how we can collectively, creatively explore feelings and emotions that those recollections of historical events brought out in the participants. So during the making of the film, as most of my research, I'm very, very guided by the writings of Svetlana Alexievich, who in her work treats people's feelings about various catastrophic events such as World War II or Chernobyl as valid historical documents. In the same vein, in my film, I treated people's dreams, memories, and emotions as documents. Documents that we creatively and imaginatively archived in this film. So there's a particular quote that really speaks to me, which is that I look out for life, for people who have been shaken to the core by life, by the everyday. In telling his own story, a person creates, he doesn't copy reality, he creates. Memories are living creatures. And again, that speaks to my interest in Freud's idea of spring memories and also the idea of performative and experiential archiving being a creative method. So I also want to say that Alexievich's emphasis on studying histories that have been overlooked, pushed aside, has informed my approach that very much concentrated on this idea of what's often dismissed and it's been confined to secrecy, needs to find its ways to come out, but not as facts. I think this is what I was interested in, how can we creatively design images that I think will be in some ways attractive to people, that people would want to look at them, but at the same time don't think about what they really mean. So the question of how to give testimony to an event that contains multiple truths. Once again, Svetlana Alexievich, who believes that truth is dispersed among many people, and that cores of people is required to get to the truth, but we need to create scenarios for multiple testimonies to be able to exist at the same time, as opposed to choosing one over the other. And she says that truth doesn't fit into one heart or mind. The truth is so fragmented. There is a lot of it, and it's scattered around the world. So what we shared, as those of you who managed to see it, and I hope you will come on Sunday, you will see that the film is a polyphony. The characters and places and themes thread their way through the film's frames, appear again and again, often in relation to different periods in history. So there's no particular narrative, there's no beginning, middle, and end. The film does not in any way provide any synthesis. Instead, there's suspension in time and place as the film explores how the more prosaic accounts of trauma resurface in the everyday. And I want to briefly talk about how I work with a critical framework around nostalgia and Ostranenie. Since we are in the Center for Eastern European Russian Studies, I thought that would be quite fitting. So back in 2018, when I went to Abkhazia to do my residency, I was trying to understand how Abkhazia became from this paradise-like land that all the Soviet elite would go and have their holidays. A lot of people even from Poland at the time would go to Abkhazia and enjoy the beautiful Black Sea coast. It was referred to as the Soviet Florida, which tells you, I think, says a lot. So how Abkhazia went from the Soviet Florida that everyone wanted to visit to this abandoned de facto state in which herbicides coexist with terrible architecture. And I struggle to understand and see all those beautiful cultural palaces just being so decrepit. So for example, this is I lived across the street from this old dance hall, which now looks like this. And of course, I want to make a point that for the right reason, Abkhaz people are very careful about Westerners coming in and publishing yet another album of photographs containing ruin porn. So this is a trap that I have actually fallen into myself in the stages of my film. And it was pointed out to me by one of my performers that's not the way to go. So, which is very helpful because those ruins aesthetically, they are quite beautiful and they are quite captivating. There is something interesting. There's all sorts of different ways of thinking about ruins. You know, the nature taking over ruins. There's a whole other discourse around it. But that's not what I was exploring. So again, this idea of herbicides, so buildings that show, of course, the effects of the war, and also the turbo architecture, which are Sukhumins has quite a lot of those villas of the novel rishets, so people who have made money in the transition from Soviet Union to capitalism, often through back channels, to say lightly. So both types of architecture, the turbo architecture and the herbicide, function as a constant reminder of the painful transition, like I said, from the Soviet Republic to a post-war de facto state, with its lawless times and stable isolation that Abkhazia is experiencing. So there's a certain, like I mentioned in the beginning, Abkhazia is often talked about in relation to this idea of being suspended in time and place. And I think I don't need to say this, in a lot of places where conflict had persisted and existed, architecture is also heavily politicized. That's yet another talk that I'm preparing for something else, but I have to school myself in architecture studies, which actually I'm becoming increasingly, in urban studies, increasingly more interested in. So I also want to say that I wanted to look under the surface of this idea of Soviet Florida, because of course, given the timing and the 30s, at the same time as Abkhazia was being marketed as Soviet Florida, because Stalinist purges were taking place. And that's a picture that was not ever taken. It's a picture that has not been talked about, or certainly not at that time. So what I did in my film, in order to address this imbalance and the tension between, which actually exists in Abkhaz society till this day, the tension between what Abkhazia used to be, or seemingly used to be, I think it's more about what it could have been, and what it is right now. I collaborated with a neural network engineer who helped me process some of the archival, or some of the images, which I'll talk about in a minute. I processed some of the images through an artificial intelligence software. And those images come from albums that some of you might have seen. I've encountered them in Georgia, as well. These are albums that are propagandist albums that a lot of intellectual families would have in their houses. And the albums always open with a picture of Stalin at the front. This first picture is a picture of Stalin in his uniform. And then there's a propaganda. And that, in many ways, very interesting images to work with. And what I noticed was that when I started processing them through this artificial intelligence software, the way it works is that you put this image until you upload it in a way that we converted our images yesterday. You upload it to the website, and you merge it. Artificial intelligence merges it with an image of your choice, in which case it shows the Black Sea, and then it spits out something like that. And what I was interested in, the images I was receiving had a lot of the darkness in them. I thought that was really interesting. There's the darkness that, the kind of artificial intelligence bot picked up on, was very randomly, but it's the darkness that doesn't exist in those images. And it's this is the darkness under the surface that I was trying to talk about. And I also thought, this is one of the Stalin's dachas, which we also processed. That took quite a lot of images, because every time you process an image, the bot does something different. And I thought it was really also interesting thinking about this idea of Walter Benjamin's, how we always interpret history from the present. So every time I reprocess the image, it will come out as a different image. And you can adjust the parameters and all of that. But nonetheless, the darkness, I thought, was very telling. So I also want to say that, one thing I wanted to say is that Manana Bigvava, who is one of the actresses in the film, Manana provided the only real archival material that we have, which is images of her family history, which you see throughout the film. This is the most conventional part of the most documentary-like part of the film. in which Manana does talk about her family and the fact that her great-grandfather knew Beria, for example. And these are her images, her family images, family history images are not processed with anything, they are left as they are. So finally, I want to talk very briefly about Shklovsky's idea of Ostranenie, which I know many of you probably know. So what I was interested in with his idea of Ostranenie, the defamiliarization, is about looking for new means of generating more contemporary interpretations and perspectives of images that in Abkhazia everybody knows, those propagandist images we talked about, and trying to destabilize some of those images, some of those narratives, by contrasting them with others. And what I really take away from Shklovsky, which I've always liked, was that he saw art as a technique to discover how things are being experienced and felt, as opposed to things being understood, which is again speaks to my idea of Svetlana Alexievich's idea of the emotions and feelings, Roncier's idea of not necessarily having to understand things, but feel things, and then again my idea of performative and experiential archiving method. So finally, I want to talk very, very briefly about the question of nostalgia, but particularly in the context of Svetlana Bohem, I realized that the field of nostalgia studies is very, very large, and this is a work in progress for me, so I haven't done a huge amount of reading outside of Svetlana Bohem. But what I've experienced myself when I was in Abkhazia, I developed a certain state of work called melancholia, because I realized that I felt very, very comfortable in this place. But I also realized that the comfort that came was very complicated, because it was the comfort of sharing of the traumatic family stories. And it was, of course, the decaying architecture, which I also remember from back in Poland, communist Poland, before it transitioned to capitalism. Yeah. So anyway, also Manana and I, one of the performers and I often talked a lot about our familial histories, and that's how we also got to explore the subject of intergenerational trauma, which forms part of the film. So while I was experiencing all those emotions, I also want to just remark that I was increasingly struggling with this idea of how can I make the film in a place that I only spent 2 months in. And that was not allowing me to sleep at night. And I thought the only way to do it would be for me to really be very open and authentic about my own emotions that the place causes in me. And I had to really properly investigate why I felt the way I felt in Abkhazia. And that's how I got to work with Svetlana's Bohem concept of reflective nostalgia, which then again, like I said, led me to explore the ideas around intergenerational trauma. Okay. So through my autofictional narrator, I was able to explore the notions that Abkhazia and Poland at some point had some kind of a shared Soviet history. And so for the duration of the film, when we created this temporary community, the terrain between Abkhazia and Poland became like a one zone of memory, which is also exemplified in the house, which became one of the main places for our set. And it became clear that some of our feelings, my feelings and the performance feelings about the now, the Abkhazia of the now, were really shaped by the experiences of our ancestors. And Bohem argued that nostalgia is about the relationship between individual biography and the biography of nations. So the idea, between relationship between collective and personal memories, which is something that my work is very much exploring. And this drives a need for a certain intimacy with the world. And for Bohem, reflective nostalgia dwells on the ambivalences of human longing and belonging, and does not shy away from any contradictions. And I'm very interested in contradictions. I'm not interested in clear answers and ideas that are worked out and that we know what they are. So what Bohem said that nostalgia, reflective nostalgia, calls for the absolute truth into doubt, called the absolute truth into doubt. It lingers on ruins, on the patina of time and history, and in the dreams of another place and another time. Okay, and I want to show you the final clip.
Back in Poland, I grew up around memories of war. It's the long silences between my grandparents' words and the gaps in their stories that I often dream about. As a child, I want to be a librarian. My father brings me blank index cards from his army library so I can make a card for every book about the war we have at home. My grandfather is the one who plays library with me. Hello, I would like to borrow ashes and diamonds, my grandfather might say. Oh, I am sorry, sir, I would reply. It's not been returned yet. Well then, do you have anything else on World War II that I haven't read yet? He can hardly say the words, but he knows that this scenario pleases me the most. For a long time I'm afraid to know, but when I finally ask my grandparents about the war, my one grandfather says nothing. His gaze, intensely focused on the window, even though nothing worth noting is happening outside. Why talk about bad things, my child? In her dreams, my grandmother is still running away from the soldiers through a forest. It is winter, heavy snow. She has no shoes. Or maybe it's her middle sister with no shoes. My other grandmother describes how the soldiers burned the whole village down. That same day, they shot her father. Years later, when the flames broke out in our house on the night before your parents' wedding, my grandmother tells me, for a split second I thought that the war had started and that I would lose my house again. Where would we go this time?
So final couple of words on nostalgia time. So as Boehm argued, nostalgia is it's quite a complex feeling, and it can produce representations that are erroneous and that make the affected lose touch with the present. And the one who experiences nostalgia, according to Boehm, also experiences its location in time and space, which is in a way what we shared is also about in settling what I experienced making it. So as Boehm says that for the nostalgic, future perfect and distant past are merged together, destined to hypnotize the viewer into a complete oblivion of the present. So here I'm kind of playing my own devil's advocate and questioning my own interest in nostalgia while making a film about Abkhazia, which potentially I had a question to myself the other day, whether that was altogether a wrong approach, because it does facilitate the continuation of the suspended state that Abkhazia already finds itself in. So that's a question for my, I address for my future work, which I do have some ideas about. And also a lot of footage about Abkhazia again. So I just want to conclude finally that while making what we shared, like Svetlana Alexievich in her writing, I also followed emotions, and instead of facts, I sought to document things that leave no trace. But unlike Svetlana Alexievich in her writing, perhaps naively, when I was making what we shared, I wasn't aware that I was taking notes on the future. Thank you.
So thank you, Camilla. We have time for questions, both from our live audience, you're all live, the in-person audience, and those joining us over Zoom. If you are joining over Zoom and you wish to ask our speaker a question, you can place that question or a comment in the Q&A portion of that we do. Is it Q&A? Is the button, not chat, is the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will feed those, I'll relay those questions to our speaker. But if we have anyone in the audience here, or please have at it. Please.
Just a comment, there's some research, I think it's out of Harvard, I'm blanking on the researcher's name, but she convinced, we always use undergrads for guinea pigs, right? And she convinced a group of undergraduate students at Harvard of, they call them rich text memories is one of the terms, but basically she conspired with their parents, unbeknownst to the students, found out about their early childhood history, and then had them come into the lab and would talk to them about, under some false pretext, about what happened when you were a child, blah, blah, blah. And then they would introduce one entirely false story And with the help of the parents, she succeeded in convincing somewhere in the neighborhood of 65 to 70% of them of a completely false story about their own childhood. That, long story short, at the end, they debrief the students and say, hey, this is where we lied to you and how we lied to you. And even after being told that the story was false, some of the students still had a hard, some of them at the end still said, well, I think maybe some of that's true. The point, going back to what you said when I first walked in 30 minutes late, that memories aren't really videotapes of the past. They're new constructions. And some of those students made new constructions about their own past and had kind of a hard time letting go of it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I've read up about it, and I think that we still have a conversation about psychotherapy and various methods, which actually this is my training I'm currently receiving in psychotherapy, and transpersonal psychotherapy is something that I use. I didn't tell you the interdisciplinary approach to the method that I've used, because that would be another conversation. But yeah, I think I've been increasingly more interested in those group dynamics and how people actually negotiate what a memory is. So this is a fantastic example, and of course also raises a lot of ethical questions if you were to transport exactly that approach to the conflict zone. But I think it's also interesting to think about it in the era of fake news. I think, how that, what's a fact and how do you deny? But actually, what actually really happened and who says how and when, and I think it's becoming increasingly more complicated.
Of course, it can never happen to us because we remember everything perfectly.
Yeah, right. But that's why I think also the idea of emotion, concentrating on emotions, and it's got this idea of affective truth in some ways, because I think it's more potent nowadays than concentrating on more facts themselves. Because I think that's what we do to hold us up, I think, very quickly. Thank you.
I actually have a question along similar lines, because it has to do with this formulation that you've used several times. It was both, I think, in the film and also in the talk, was people having, or not individuals, but groups of people displaying multiple truths, or having their own individual takes on a particular event, whether one that is in the cultural memory or people having different memories of the same event that they both experienced. You never commented, though, on when that kind of, say, personal truth spills into fantasy, self-deception, or outright falsehood, right? And I'm looking at this, I've been thinking about this a great deal. I'm writing something about this as well. I'm looking at this image, seeing this conflict as the action, the thing that people have acted on through incompatible perceptions of reality. That on the Russian, an 18-year-old kid fighting for Putin is operating in a completely different perception of material existence from the people who are standing holding these signs. So I was wondering if that enters into the film. I haven't seen the film yet, or how you, in your own work, grapple with the fact that people don't just have their own sets of beliefs or perceptions, but they act on them. And when they act on them, they're sometimes acting against each other, not because they're opposed individually, but because one group is responding to one reality and the other group is responding to a completely incompatible reality.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question here. This film doesn't exactly address it in ways that I think in some ways that will be for me a separate film, but it's the one that I have been thinking about, and I'm a great admirer of, I don't know if anyone of you know Joshua Oppenheimer's work. And once again, something that Svetlana Alexievich also talked about, that all those views, wherever they come from, they need representation of sorts. They need to enter into the picture. So there's one character in my film who we've had quite significant conversations that involved a lot of disagreements about politics. But that's a slightly separate story, and I knew that he was coming from a very different place. But I also wanted to have him in the film because on some level, I think he also realized that through the process of the making of the film, and I'm speaking for him, but that's my understanding, that he realized that he had some shared experiences with all these other people, even though he's coming from a very different place. So I think, but it's something that I think it's a really good question around the developing of the method of this performative and experiential archiving. How do you work with that? And I think that's something that I have been thinking about. And Joshua Oppenheimer has been my guy in Svetlana Alex, which talks about this idea of how we also need to understand, equally, we need to understand, the victims of the conflicts, the perpetrators, and everybody who is in between, who might. So yeah, it's a great question, but I don't have an answer. That's definitive at this point. Yeah. But I think, with what we see with of course, Ukraine right now, and I have enough friends in Ukraine and Russia, how, of course, the misinformed this Russian society is right now. It's absolutely terrifying. The level of misinformation we're talking about it yesterday. I think it's yielding some, scenarios and solutions that I think are very, very frightening. Because I think, I was saying to you guys last night that there's a survey that's been conducted recently that talks about apparently 85% of Russian society wants war with Poland. And apparently they need it. So where does that come from? Yeah.
It's a very fascinating presentation, Dr. Klitz. I mean, this idea of experiment, or rather experiential archiving is fascinating. I'm doing my research on diaspora as well, and I think this idea of what we shared is quite salient to that experience, because there is, I think, from what I've sort of observed in my own research, is that there is this understanding that we share something as a diaspora. But then the question, I guess, to also what Professor Palov was suggesting just now, is what we shared, like what is that thing that we shared, and then further, how do we act on that in the future, and what steps do we take? And so I think that using this experiential method of memory and dream that you have elaborated upon here, I think perhaps one could look at which specific dreams and memories are the ones that become acted upon, especially in a diaspora context, and to see where possible disagreements do arise in terms of that, what we share. So that's more of a comment than a question. I guess I do also have a question, and it's related to the last Kreis lecture with the conversation with Adam Leszczyński and his book about Ludowa Historia Polski. And one of the themes that arose in that lecture was this idea of accessing sort of untold stories from the people themselves, as opposed to this very formal history, and a history that's told by those in power. I wonder if you see your work and this method of archiving through that lens. I mean, is this, I suppose this could be intended, this method of experiential archiving could be intended to document the sort of memories and dreams of the authorities, but also just everyday people. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
But once again, if you can get to the authorities and you could actually trust that the responses will be authentic, or even not, actually, that could also be interesting. But I just wanted to thank you for that. I want to make a comment about your original comment, that I think what I was interested in this, developing this method, and I'm still continuously interested in that, is that, we all have a stake at how those events are represented. Because in the film, if you watch the film and you see the film is very much about representation and how you construct the representation, how mediated it is. So I think I'm speaking very much from the perspective of a moving image artist, as opposed to a specialist in past politics and Ukraine war for that matter. So war in Ukraine. But I think the idea of that, we've got to move away from thinking, oh, here's the war is over there and we are here. But I think the idea of sharing, and also sharing some of the responsibilities and sharing some of the actions, I think that's the direction in which I would like the method to also move towards, that can be used in different contexts. Like I said, I'm not just artists, but perhaps, you know, NGO organizations, as problematic as they often are themselves, but that becomes more interdisciplinary. Yeah. But as for the alternative histories, I have a bit of an issue with the word alternative in this context, because I think these are histories as equal, the same as the ones that's, you know, or actually these are in some ways more valid, often more valid versions of histories than the one that we learn in history books. And, you know, coming from a country like Poland, where I think I have a natural distrust of official narratives. And I still remember how our history books were changing. Yeah.
If I use the word alternative, I meant to say untold.
Yeah, and I think you did say actually, maybe, yeah, you did mention
I might
too.
have.
So I think, yeah, so creating spaces for those histories to enter into the discourse, I think that's what I'm, you know, aiming for, which is that's what Svetlana Alex is doing so beautifully. You know, there's nobody else like her. You can't approximate what she's done in secondhand time, or, you know, all the books. I'm reading the Boys in Zinc right now, and it's just, oh God, yeah, I don't read it before I go to sleep, but yeah, so that's a very, I think that's a very powerful proposition. That's how do we, you know, collectively create possibilities and scenarios where we all chip into, you know, just doing something about the world, and yeah, not just seeing it as, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day in Barcelona. There's not that many news on the war in Ukraine in Spanish on Spanish TV, because it also depends where you are geographically, right? So yeah, I think that's a problem. Yeah. I don't know if that answers.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Oh, it didn't come up on mine. Oh wait, it did. There we go. Thank you. We have one a question came in over Zoom from Heidi Goulding, who thanks you for your talk, Camilla, and says she's intrigued by your acknowledgement that your work is furthering the, quote, oblivion of the present, which I believe is Svetlana Boyn's line, by recreating traumatic memories. On the flip side, people with traumatic memories often want to share their memories either for catharsis or posterity or some other reason. Can you tell us about the ethical or emotional considerations that guided your team as you collected and reenacted traumatic memories?
So I think I said at the end of the talk that I was playing my own devil's advocate, thinking about this idea of, you know, nostalgia as understood by Bowen as somehow suffering from being caught in between past and future, but not quite addressing the present. So I don't think that that's what I was doing, but I have to acknowledge that there's definitely some of that going on that, you know, to do. But I think this is where I wasn't interested in making a straightforward documentary film that deals with the facts, because I think a film like that would have to, you know, acknowledge both sides. And you would have to go to all those places. In Georgia, you have to go to that district in Abkhazia where all the refugees are. And that was simply not within the scope of this project, which I also, the technicalities and logistics of what's possible also, you know, also define what work you eventually make. But in terms of the catharsis, again, I'm very skeptical, well, not skeptical, but I guess it's not my area of expertise, how art can be used as some form of, you know, therapy or catharsis. And I'm slightly suspicious of some of those methods. But that wasn't our plan. The plan was that people have volunteered originally what memories they wanted to share. And they shared with me what they wanted to share with me, and then I had to work with that. Or we all collectively had to work with that. So I wasn't fishing, I wasn't asking leading questions. It was a scenario in which people were able to, you know, basically withdraw some of the memories. So what happened, which is, I haven't talked about it in this talk because I've been talking about it so much. One of my performers in the film, particularly vocal about my interest in women porn at the time, and also my script, parts of my script have, like I said, challenged me on some of the ideas. And I said to him, okay, but this is a story you shared with me when I came here back in 2018. And he said, yes, but I shared it with you on sound recording. And I now don't want to be seen film saying those things about my country because I don't want the world. And he said, I've changed my mind since anyway. But of course, you know, and I had, speaking to the question of ethical approach, I had all the release forms signed, and if I wanted to use it, I could have used it. But that's not the relationship we had on the set. That's not what we developed. And we've had a long conversation about the script. This is a lunch that lasted about 6 hours. And in the end, we were able to recognize that we come from slightly different very different political stances, very different places, but we're able to negotiate what he was comfortable with. And what he wanted to contribute to the film. And he's a character, the only character in the film who speaks Abkhaz, and he's a professional performer that leads the youth theatre. And on the subject, further on the subject of ethics, I decided that I needed to incorporate his doubt about the script into the film, so that you'll find that in the film too, because I felt that was an interesting interrogation of my own, process that I needed to include in there. So, and I felt that was an appropriate response for me to do at the same time, still making a film that I had certain vision for. Yeah.
I myself have lots of questions, but we'll be having lunch afterwards, so it's.
I just had a last comment along the same lines when my grandfather was dying. I was visiting with him, literally on his deathbed. He told me a story about when he was in World War II. He was part of we call them a mop-up force where they were taking on German prisoners of war. The Germans were largely just surrendering to them. And he confessed, I think, to unburden himself, that as they were all 18 years old or whatever, they were taking the prisoners and they were robbing them. As they were surrendering, they took their medals, they took their photo, anything that they thought had some value. And he had a box of these medals hidden in his garage. And at the end of his story, what he seemed to want me to take away from it was he kept repeating, we were no better than they were. They were kids, we were kids. They had stuff, they were surrendering, we took their stuff. And I think he had kept that memory, for 50, 60 years. Yeah, it completely changes your view, because everything, in the United States, what you hear about World War II from history books is very heroic.
I think it's a brilliant observation. It's something that I've also commented on in my other presentations on the subject. Svetlana Alexievich also talks about it in her A Woman in the Face of War. But there, in one individual can exist two truths. One which is the one for you or for the quiet room, and then the other one that is for the outside world. Is the heroic one, is the one that you want the world to see, which again perpetuates the meta narratives that we are trying to combat in the values of war. Yeah.
Final word. Well, first of all, thank you so much. I just go back to my memories to my stories of my parents about Abkhazia, and they always said that was the best place to go for vacation. Yeah, that was I remember. And thank you so much for this just wonderful. I just think that you will go to see more people. And what I'm thinking, I was just thinking about the future, and if ever we will have some story about Ukraine, what we shared. So I was thinking that to my country, there will be just a big challenge to make this collective memory from individuals, because even right now you can imagine that the people who are right now in Lviv or in western part of Ukraine, thank goodness nothing happened so far. They have and people live like kind of normal life. And if we just talk to survivors from Mariupol, you could imagine that these narratives could be radically different.
Yeah.
And how to collect all together to put it in a whole picture of what is truth and what is safe.
Yeah. I'm sure that Svetlana Alexievich will be on it, made an amazing job. But I also think, what's interesting about it, thank you, is that, that there needs to be a certain amount of time that passes between, the trauma and the tragedy, and people need to have some time to process, including people who are gathering information. And I think with Abkhazia, it's 10 years. It's a lot of years, and the conflict is still so present in people's minds. So I can't imagine them doing it like right now. Of course, the reporters are doing it, the photographers and the journalists are doing a fantastic job. But yeah, that's something that I think with passing of time, I remember when Patrick Bigelow, Zero Dark 30 came out. And I thought, other than lots of other problems with it, he was so close to the events that happened, and I felt like she didn't give herself enough time to process that, to think about it, and develop a different perspective. So I think, yeah, I hope that, I hope this will be over soon. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being here once again. Thank you. I think I understood that.
Yes, I think we're, yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you, Camilla, for sharing this wonderful material with us. As a reminder, was it 1:15 on Sunday is the premiere of the film at the Ann Arbor Film Festival, right here at the Michigan Theater, just down the street. And please join us for our other events that were announced at the beginning of today's talk. And thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.